Well, hello, this is Mike from Music City, and welcome to the latest installment of Ranking Records. Today, we're going to look at perhaps one of the greatest American bands of all time, and that is the Byrds. And what we're going to do this today a little bit differently and sort of, kind of start off with a little history lesson of this band and talk about the records chronologically, talk to you about the personnel changes and give you a little bit of history, and then kind of talk about the highlights of each record and what I think about some of the tracks and the records in general, and then maybe go back and just give you my top five Byrds albums. There's 12 albums here, and sometimes I think ranking 12 albums, that you really like all of them to a great extent, it gets kind of tricky. So we're gonna cut out some of that tediousness for you. But anyway, the Byrds. Now let me speak to sort of today's audience out there. People who follow Americana and bands like Wilco, the Jayhawks, Sun Volt, whatever. Boy, if you haven't gone back and discovered the music of the Byrds, I think you're really missing something. One of the most influential bands in musical history, and just one with a great tenure of music out there. Now, there are, we're going to do CDs today, and I've got 11 CDs here that came out as reissues on the Columbia Legacy series a few years back. And they're all just beautiful collections with tons and tons of bonus tracks, great liner notes, remastered, sound fantastic. I really recommend trying to get these if you still could find them. Let's start off, with the Byrds, and you're gonna know these names, and the Byrds got together in 1965, and the original Byrds were Roger McGuinn, who at the time was known as Jim McGuinn. You also had Gene Clark, David Crosby, who I'm sure you know from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Chris Hillman, who later went on the Burrito Brothers, and the Desert Rose Band, and the drummer was Michael Clark. And we skipped over Gene Clark real quick, who had a fairly quiet but critically acclaimed solo career, but all great artists in their own right. And in 1965, they put out two records, and this is back then when people put out records every 6 months. We had their debut, which was Mr. Tambourine Man, followed up by Turn, Turn, Turn. Now, really, there isn't much question about it, but these records were the foundation of what we call folk rock, where the Byrds took folk songs and added, Jim McGuinn's Rickenbacker guitar and harmonies, and just created a sound. They were very influenced by the Beatles, and sort of they took what they were hearing with the Beatles and combined it into some of these traditional folk songs. And they found a big friend along the way in Bob Dylan, and really helped Dylan's career a great way by recording Mr. Tambourine Man and making it a #1 hit. And like Bob said something along the lines, it was great to hear people be able to dance to my songs. And then the follow-up, they took a song that was arranged by Pete Seeger, the folk artist, Turn, 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 actually written out of the words of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And again, they took this to a #1 hit. So two #1 hits and two great records, really the foundation of what we call today folk rock. And I mentioned the Dylan connection, and I had to go back and actually do a playlist, and I found that over the years, the Byrds have covered 16 Dylan songs, and Dylan couldn't have been happier, and I think they did him justice every time they did a Dylan song. But I think that most of us who are vaguely familiar with the Byrds know Roger McGuinn and know that throughout this, let's see, I got some notes in front of me here, 8-year tenure of the Byrds, he was the only constant throughout the entire lineup changes of the band. But back then, the real main man in the Byrds was Gene Clark. He was the front man. He got the most original songs, if I'm correct, on these two records. And you know, his one of the most famous Byrds songs of all time on here. No, excuse me, on Mr. Tambourine Man is here, is his you know, I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better, which you may know. And you know, Clark was sort of a, I don't know, somewhat of a tragic figure. You know, didn't like to fly, and I think McGuinn said something like, "Well, if you're a bird who can't fly, you know, it doesn't work." And he left the band after these two records. He made some spotted appearances here and there, but he was gone after this, and you know, but it was very interesting. Most people don't realize what an important figure he was in those first two records. So after he left, they went as a foursome. You know, sort of got Crosby and Hillman more into the spotlight, but they did this other fantastic record called 5D. And, you know, we talked about the Byrds being influential. This record is very well one of the forerunners in psychedelic music. And I'm sure you know the great song that came off of this one, 8 Miles High. And no, it's not about drugs. It's about being up in an airplane. You know, 5,000 feet in a mile times 8, that's 40,000 feet. They're up in an airplane. And fortunately, it just kind of ruined that song from being a hit because it got some bad reputation. You know, as being a drug song, but just a great record bringing psychedelia in there. You know, still had some of the folk touches in there. Mr. Spaceman, a great whimsical song by McGuinn. And I'm looking for the Dylan cover, and well, no Dylan cover, but a very landmark record in terms of psychedelia. Now, they did 2 more albums as the foursome. Younger Than Yesterday and Notorious Byrd Brothers were their next 2. Great records. I mean, I just, there's not a record in the Byrds catalog that I strongly dislike. This one has a song you probably know, So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, just a great song. And I think another great Dylan cover, My Back Pages. And if you ever see a Roger McGuinn show these days, it's his opening song, and he starts the opening Rickenbacker riff off stage, so you hear the Rickenbacker before you see him. Very well respected record by most Byrds fans. And Notorious Byrd Brothers, again, another great record as well too. Again, with some folk stuff in there. I think there was a little. This is where sort of Crosby sort of had his falling out. One of my favorite songs on this record is their cover of Carole King and Jerry Goffin's "Going Back." And you know, Crosby wanted to do original songs and didn't want to do brill building songs at the time, and that kind of got him to leave the band. But a good record. But here we are at a real turning point. Yep, Crosby got fed up. He left the band. And Mike Clark, the drummer, followed. So you're left with McGuinn and Chris Hillman. And the way the story goes, McGuinn said, we need to get a piano player. McGuinn was thinking jazz at the time. He was really kind of leaning towards a little bit of jazz. And if you go back and listen to 8 Miles High, you know, you'll hear a lot of jazz in there. Actually, a lot of that song was inspired by listening to John Coltrane. And Hillman said he knew a piano player, and of all people, that turned out to be Graham Parsons. And this idea that McGuinn had of doing an album that documented how music progressed from the year 1011 to the year 2011, I think is what he threw out, you know, didn't come to pass. And what did we get? We got the real gem in the Byrds catalog, one of the greatest records of all time. Again, we talked about how the Byrds were influential in folk rock and psychedelic rock. Well, country rock too, and with Sweetheart of the Rodeo and the influence of Graham Parsons just made this just a classic. At the time, it wasn't well loved, overlooked, but today I think most people will agree that this is one of the greatest records of all time. 2 Dylan tracks that Bob sent them while Bob was working on the Basement tapes. You Ain't Going Nowhere. Just sort of an iconic song these days in terms of classic country rock music. And also Nothing Was Delivered both came from the Basement tapes. And we had Parsons songs in here. We got his classic Hickory Wind. One of the problems with this record was Parsons was under contract with another label, and he couldn't. Some of the vocals he originally cut got erased, and McGuinn redid them. I guess they just let him do, a couple of songs. I don't know how that all worked out. Why some, but not all, but more. And then also, the bonus tracks reissued later. We did get to hear some of those Parsons vocals. But what a great record. And they also picked up a new drummer at this time called Kevin Kelly, but it didn't last. Parsons started hanging out with the Rolling Stones. Gave excuses of not wanting to go to South Africa with the band when he really wanted to just hang out with Keith Richards and get stoned. that's pretty well documented. And so the Byrds fell apart again. And really, we next get into another phase of the band, and we had two records here, the Dr. Byrd and Mr. Hyde, and the Ballad of Easy Rider, that featured McGuinn, again the one constant, with three new bandmates. Clarence White, an amazing, incredible guitar player, one of the best country rock guitar players of all time. He played if I get this right, a B-Bender Telecaster, and watch some video of him playing that thing. It's like playing a steel guitar on a guitar. It's remarkable. And that matter of fact, Marty Stewart today has Clarence White's original guitar. Clarence unfortunately died and was hit by a drunk driver when he was unloading his gear at a gig one day. The other member of the band was John York on bass, and a fellow named Gene Parsons played drums. And Gene Parsons, an interesting kind of character, also played a lot of other instruments and sang in addition to being the core drummer. But Dr. Byrd and Mr. Hyde, a great record. More Dylan stuff on here with This Wheel's on Fire. One of my favorite Byrd songs on here, Drugstore Truck Driving Man. It was a McGuinn Parsons co-write that they wrote in response to the disc jockey Ralph Emery, who was not very kind to them when they came through Nashville to do on the Sweetheart of the Rodeo, to promote Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and did the Grand Ole Opry. Good record. And then of course, just the Ballad of Easy Rider, not a soundtrack record per se, but it does have the title track song from the movie called The Ballad of Easy Rider, in addition to some other folky songs. Interestingly enough, I believe Peter Fonda had met with Dylan and tried to get, I think in New York, and tried to get Dylan to write a song for the movie, and he picked up a piece of paper and he wrote down, "The river flows, it flows to the sea, wherever that river goes is where I want to be." He said, "Here, give this to McGuinn, he'll know what to do with it." And from that, McGuinn wrote the Ballad of Easy Rider. Dylan refused to get the credit, to have a co-write credit, and the rest is history. But just a good record. Jesus Is Just a Ride is on here. I've always enjoyed the Byrds version of that. And I think, where we got with the Byrds around this time was that as a live band, they were better than they ever were. Parsons was a much better drummer than Michael Clark. Clarence White, just a great guitar player, and this band really smoked. It really smoked. Now, John York left, and for the last three Byrds albums, which we have Untitled, Bird Maniacs, and Farther Along, a fellow named Skip Batten came in and replaced York, and Batten was more more upfront than York was. Batten was a songwriter. He had a solo record out that I have and I really enjoyed, self-titled solo record. After the Byrds fell apart, I know he was in the New Riders of the Purple Sage for a while. So I was sort of a big Skip Batten fan, and I enjoyed some of the songs. But and again, and the band still smoked, with Clarence White's guitar. And the first record they did together was Untitled, which was one live record, showing you how great they were live, plus another record of studio cuts. And on here, one of the studio cuts on here is probably McGuinn, the greatest song McGuinn himself has ever wrote, and he co-wrote it with the playwright Jacques Levy for a play that they were thinking about doing. The song called Chestnut Mare, just a fantastic song. And again, what a very good Byrds record. Followed by Bird Maniacs. I've always liked the lead track, Glory, Glory. In doing my reading about the words, this seemed to be the record that everyone really wanted to put down as being the worst record the Byrds ever made. I found a few things that I liked on it. And then the final record that this group did was farther along, and here we are in 1971. So all of this 11 records happened in a very short 5-6 year period. One of my favorite all-time Byrds songs kick it off. It kicks this off, a song called Tiffany Queen. So, you know, a good record, maybe not a great record, but this was going to mark the end of the Byrds for what we thought, until one of the music industry's most I don't know, I'm trying to find adjective, but the guy with a lot of power and a lot of pull and a lot of sway, a man who can get things done, David Geffen, got the original Byrds together, McGuinn, Clark, Crosby, Hillman, and Clark, to do this record simply titled Byrds. In going back and re-listening to this, it was funny. I mean, what one of the reviewers said about it was, he said it was delightful but dull, and I couldn't think of a better description. It is a good record, but there's just no cohesiveness on it. It just doesn't sound like a band. Now, David Crosby produced the record, strangely enough. He just kind of just went into the forefront. And remember, he's coming from this Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young environment where you had four. You know, they weren't as much of a band at times as they were four individuals, and that's pretty much what happened here. Is, you know, when people were singing it wasn't much of a band. It was much more like a Gene Clark, a Chris Hillman, or a David Crosby, or a Roger McGuinn, you know, composition, much less than a band. And the other thing about this too was that reading up on it, a lot of them saved a lot of their better songs for the albums to come, and it could have been a lot better. But again, delightful but dull. Couple of things to point out before we go ahead and pick my top five. I did a lot of my homework on this by looking at this great magazine put out by the people from Uncut, The Ultimate Music Guide. I'm a big fan of The Ultimate Music Guide. I've got a whole shelf full of them. I buy every single one of them and read them cover to cover. You know, they go through the Melody Maker and NME and Uncut and compile stories chronologically, and also there's fresh reviews of every record, great discographies. Also, not only did they cover all the Byrds records, they covered all of the solo works of all the individuals. Just fantastic stuff, and it's just kind of nice to read through and just kind of trigger your mind. But I just do want to point out a couple other things. Now, as part of that Columbia Legacy series, they did put out this live record from the Fillmore in 1969, again, back when that band was smoking, you know, with Clarence White. And I strongly recommend this. And one of the things you get here is when they do this, I'm trying to look to see how long it is. No, it's not on this one. It's not on this live record. It's on this live record that came out from 71 on the Sundays label. Apparently they found some tapes in McGuinn's garage where they do like this 18-minute version of 8 Miles High, and you just got to hear it to believe it. It starts off kind of slow, but it does get pretty cracking. And then one other thing, to complete your Byrds collection, you probably want to find a copy of Pre-Flight. This was also on the Sundays label, and these were the recordings that they made before the first record. Kind of subdued, kind of quiet, not a lot of strong Rickenbacker. They really hadn't discovered folk rock yet, but definitely well worth a listen. So let's wrap this up with my top 5 Byrd records. And we'll start with number 5 is going to be Turn, Turn, Turn. I just love that folk rock sound. I love the number 1 hit of Turn, Turn, Turn. Number 4, always had a soft spot for this one. Is going to be the Ballad of Easy Rider. Love the title track. Just love the feel of this record. It just really kind of puts you in just a great mood. Number 3, 5D. Love the spacey stuff. Love the jazz influence on 8 Miles High, and just all together just a great record too. In addition to the psychedelic stuff. Number 2. We're going to go with Mr. Tambourine Man. Again, the number 1 hit was just Tambourine Man was just fantastic. I feel a whole lot better. Just a great song. Chimes of Freedom, Dylan's song, is fantastic. And number 1, no surprise, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, a record I just certainly couldn't live without. It's definitely one of my Desert Island discs. Well, I hope you enjoyed this history lesson about the Byrds and a little bit of my commentary. Just a great band, one that you really need to go back and spend some time with if you haven't. Thank you for spending time with us. We're going to continue on with the series. A lot more great music to discover. Please, if you haven't done so already, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future installments of Rankin Records. And also hit the like button and tell your friends about us. And this is Mike from Music City saying have a great day.